Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Night Games. This time we got a long one for you. It's Ring of Warmth, and it's good from now all the way through February the 28th, and it will get you 10% off orders of $10 or more at Noble Night Games. That's right, the code's going to last a long time, and it's a long code as well. It's Ring of Warmth to get you 10% off orders of $10 or more at Noble Night Games running through February the 28th. It's a perfect time to get more games after the holiday season, and if you haven't yet, why not check out Noble Knight's trade-in program? I just did it myself. It was super easy, and now I have room on my shelves to put more games. And when I buy those games, and when I buy them from Noble Night Games, I'm going to use the code Ring of Warmth, and it's running now through February 28th from our friends over at Noble Night Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. Today, he said we're going to talk about yet another thing that Chaosium makes that I love, Stu Horvath.
Hey, Hambone, how you doing?
Good, how you doing?
Pretty good. I had to parse that for a second. I was like, another thing that, oh, yeah, okay, he didn't say the word, though. Okay, I was like, but Hambone's not made by Chaosium.
Buddy, my heart. But you know, if I was made by a RPG company, I probably would be made by Chaosium, because we do love them, and also they make great stuff.
Yeah.
And I will say this, like a lot of the art in their books, the dudes always have good hair, so, you know.
That's true. That's true.
So, Stu, what are we talking about today?
Well, you know, it's funny. We've done Traveler, we did Warhammer, and like we've slowly been taking care of the most requested stuff. The thing that I get most requested nowadays is for RuneQuest. So we're going to do RuneQuest, even though every time somebody's like, when are you going to do RuneQuest? I'm like, I think we already did. Like, I feel like that one's done, because I feel like we've talked about it sort of like tangentially so many times in the past. It's long overdue for it to get its official episode. So here we go. Vintage RPG Podcast, RuneQuest.
Yeah, I think we talked around it a lot. I don't think we've ever actually done, because, you know, to be quite honest, dear listener, when you pass 100 episodes, you kind of forget some stuff. Like, I know the first one that we did ever was the Monster Manual 2.
Yep.
And I know the second one that we did was Call of Cthulhu. Then after that, who knows? Like, it's a blur. We've talked about a lot of topics. We've talked to a lot of people. So yeah, I guess it's time to do RuneQuest finally.
Yeah, like usually my trick is to try and remember what I used for the art for the post. And if I could do that, then that means that we probably did an episode, obviously. So like, anyway, RuneQuest is one of the oldest and most influential role-playing games. While I was writing the book, whenever I talked to somebody for it, I asked them a question about whether or not they thought role-playing games were inevitable. Was Dungeons and Dragons a unique catalyst, or was somebody going to get there if D&D didn't exist? And I generally believe that RPGs were inevitable, and I think that it was, you had even money on either Chaosium or Game Designers Workshop doing it if TSR didn't exist. RuneQuest spins out of a war game, a strategy war game called White Bear Red Moon, which is set in this sort of thrilling Bronze Age culture that's it's this gigantic cultures clash war. There's dragons and chaos beasts and magic and individual characters, champions for the armies. And it's just this wild, rich strategy game that comes out in 1975. And the world, of course, that it's set in is Glorantha. And like, people go kind of crazy for it. Like it just has this rich kind of depth to it that a lot of strategy games didn't have. There's so much lore in the rule book, just enough to make people want more. This is partly because Glorantha kind of existed as a thought experiment since the 60s. Greg Stafford sort of just decided one day to kind of create his own fantasy world, similar to how J.R.R. Tolkien did it with Middle-earth and M.A.R. Barker did for Tekabel. Empire of the Petal Throne, which he started like developing a language for the 40s, and then the world kind of followed suit. So Stafford does the same thing with Glorantha. And right around the same time, Ed Greenwood's doing the same thing up in Canada with Forgotten Realms. He's making his own fantasy world to write fiction in. So like, there's just something in the water in the 20th century with people wanting to make made up worlds. So Stafford uses this as the basis for the strategy game. The strategy game is really successful and gets all these fans. And it's in 1975. So this game called D&D is out there. And people want to play a D&D like game in Glorantha. They want to explore Glorantha in that way. And Stafford's kind of like, nah. He started Chaosium basically specifically to make war games. So like they kind of flirt with role-play games initially a couple times. Like they think about publishing like a nice version of Arduin, but then back off because they decide that it's too derivative of D&D. They published the All the World's Monsters books, which are really the first role-playing game monster manuals, beating TSR to the punch by a couple months, which really pissed off TSR. But like they don't really get into it until 1979. Just RuneQuest fans like beg Stafford to like please let us develop this game. So he put together this team and they build the game out of Steve Perrin was writing for Alarms and Excursions, which was an amateur press association, which is basically like a bunch of zines collected and bound together every month. They're weird and cool. And Alarms and Excursions has been going on since the very beginning of the hobby, and it's still going on today. And a lot of like game design it was like an open forum for game design. Steve Perrin creates this thing called the Perrin Conventions, which is an alternate combat system for Dungeons and Dragons. And Stafford loves this thing, and they use that as sort of the engine block to build RuneQuest out of. Geez, that I feel like that's the episode. You know, we'll do part 2 next week.
That's it. We're done. Wrap it up, guys.
Maybe this is why we've not done RuneQuest, is because RuneQuest is really complex. We've only covered like 3 years and it's still not even made. So RuneQuest comes out in 1978. It's pretty rudimentary, but it changes a whole lot of stuff. It like immediately sort of puts forth a different style of role playing. It's still derivative of D&D like most games around this time are, but it tries to do the things that D&D does using completely different systems. It's not a clone the way that like Buddies and Burrows is. It's a percentile skill system. It gets rid of class. There's no idea of class. Everybody is sort of defined by their skills and their abilities. Magic is available to everyone. And there's multiple systems of magic that everyone can kind of get involved in. All of this creates an interface with the world of Glorantha that is really complex and comes to involve the religions of the world. There's divine magic. The runes themselves are sort of the building blocks of the world, and power can be derived from them because everything's sort of created through a configuration of runes, right? So humanity is a combination of the man rune and the light rune because we like sunlight. Whereas trolls are a combination of the man rune and dark because they don't like the sunlight. It's a cool thing because trolls and humans, like this is, this early 70s, late 70s, early 80s. And they're already kind of like toy with this idea that these fantasy races are just different sorts of people. Like a lot of space is used in RuneQuest to sort of develop trolls as a really complex and fully realized culture that interfaces with the dominant human culture in different ways. Sometimes it's hostile, sometimes it's friendly, and nothing's easy, clear, or like black and white in RuneQuest. Everything is shades of gray. Another thing that is super different about RuneQuest is that because there's no classes and there's no real progression, it's a very dangerous system. Like you could increase your magic through hard work and training, but there's no inherent awards for adventuring other than money and maybe some cool armor. In the way that in D&D you get as you level up, you get new powers. That doesn't happen in RuneQuest. So it makes the game pretty dangerous. Low hit points. Your hit points don't go up over time. So combat's always a kind of dicey option. RuneQuest uses a hit location scheme. You have 6 different hit locations. That makes combat extremely deadly. And even when you're not dead, it is often said that it's not a combat in RuneQuest unless somebody loses a limb. There is healing magic, of course, that sort of mitigates that. But there are an awful lot of dismembered adventurers out there in RuneQuest. It is just like It is just a fast and violent system for combat. And because of that, it really discourages combat in a way that is the opposite of Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is all about combat. RuneQuest, it really encourages the social and cultural approach to just about everything. You want to use violence as a last resort, kind of like real life. And that's kind of cool. That's extremely different for the time period. And out of this springs all of the basic role-playing games that Chaosium would later do. And all of this is philosophical underpinning of all of their games. Like the same thing is true of Call of Cthulhu. Like you're fragile. You want to avoid combat. Stormbringer is all about like getting as much power as you can, but still being like a frail human being and burning out. There's a frailty at the heart of all of Chaosium's games, and it really begins with RuneQuest.
You know, I've said it before about Chaosium's games, whereas with Dungeons and Dragons, it's a power fantasy. Chaosium often does the powerless fantasy, where you are playing a more dangerous game by and large, because you're right. You're not going to wake up one day, pour yourself a cup of Joe and be like, oh, I'm a new level, fireball. Like, you don't get to just do that in games like this.
Like, holy crap, I feel like I could take 2 more punches today.
Yeah, no.
Like, what? It's such a strange abstraction.
Yeah, because let me tell you something. As a man who's about to turn 43, I'm scared of a high curb. So every day that I live is not a day moving in a stronger, more powerful direction. You know, and I appreciate that. I recently just played a level 20. Everyone's like level 20 Dungeons and Dragons game where we did the Bloodstone Mines. Yeah, you know, we talked about this on a previous show, and I was like, you know, man, why not try it? Because like when I do D&D with my group, we usually just play through a couple campaign books and then just start new characters and start different levels, just try things out, keep it fresh. Never done something that high before. So I was like, you know, the heck with it. Let's just do it. Let's try it. And let me tell you, even at like level 20, people are scared to do stuff. Right. And listen, my girlfriend had a Vorpal sword, and one other dude had like a wish, and this other guy like had a Holy Avenger, and they were still scared to do stuff. Like they eventually won, and they won by like the skin of their teeth, and they got very clever. You know, shout out to my Wednesday night group. You made me work for it that night. However, like you are so almost overpowered, you're afraid to use that power because it's not really a dangerous situation anymore, but you're just overthinking going into it. Whereas Chaosium games that I've played, it's always like, yeah, a hard fart will kill you, so maybe don't get on that elevator. Like you are constantly thinking about ways around having to go into combat because you don't have a Holy Avenger. You don't have a Vorpal sword. You don't have a wish. You don't have anything but maybe a gun. Maybe you have like some weird, like kooky ruin that you found somewhere, or like a weird old artifact that might not also work in your favor. Like it could go either way. And so, you know, the idea of doing that with a fantasy world where you're like, I don't want to fight this dude because I like legs and having a pair of them. Like that to me is more of a challenge, I think, because, and a rightful challenge, because you should be concerned going onto a battlefield in RuneQuest or in Call of Cthulhu or on any of these like wonderful products Chaosium makes.
Yeah, and with RuneQuest, it really shifts the priorities of the game. And remember, this was a game that was people wanted to make this game because they wanted to learn more about the world. So by making violence dangerous, it makes the priority to not be in violent situations. Exploration, cultural standing, you know, trade, all of these things kind of open up. Violence is there. It's a violent world, and violence is always a potential consequence. Just like the Old West, like you know, sometimes you're just minding your own business and violence comes to town, right? But the focus, the idea, the goals of the game are to grow in society and take on responsibilities. You want to become a rune master of your cult. You want to always like everybody's sort of interfacing with their cult. Religion's a really big thing in RuneQuest. And there is a progression in your cult. You can get extra powers, but with those powers comes extra responsibility. You become a priest in an organization that has obligations to the society because those cults don't just exist as like power vectors for your characters. They exist because they serve the community. So like you could be part of the Storm Bull Spirit Society stamping out chaos. And like that's their, because chaos, we'll get a little, we're going to have to do a totally separate episode on like the world of Glorantha, because it's just too much. There's too much, Hambo. So chaos is a bad thing. It's taboo for most of Glorantha societies, and the Storm Bull is like the god of hating chaos. So there's people who like join the Storm Bull Spirit Society, and they're sort of like barbarian inquisitors who look for chaos and stamp it out wherever they can. That sounds like a really cool thing for a player character adventurer to be.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the better you get at being a Storm Bull chaos puncher, the more the cult needs you to do stuff specifically for them. You need to stay in town and make sure that the brew aren't screwing the cattle. So you get these powers, but they're hampered by responsibility. Original RuneQuest goes with this very old school and very kind of out of fashion idea that you play multiple characters. Once you get that character who's a rune master, they're going to be out of play because of these responsibilities. So you need to have like a couple characters, partly because they could die, but partly because you want to switch them in and out as you need them. And the campaigns and adventures are written to reflect that. Most of the time, you know, you're going to be playing your lower level characters, but every once in a while you're going to hit a situation where you're going to have to go and like pull your rune masters out of like whatever they're doing because it's an emergency, and we need that like that juice, right? And like this idea of managing a grouping of characters is really different, because like that's not what D&D is about. That's not what role playing at this time is about. It really is about, you know, you're focusing on this one character, bringing him from game to game, and that weird tournament style scheme that Gygax worked up for the early first edition D&D. So like this idea of like having like a troupe of characters that you kind of jump in and out of, sort of unique at the time, and gives you opportunities to explore. Again, it's not about power. It's not about killing as many bad guys. More characters means more friction points in the world for you to explore. You don't have to all be in the same cult. You could have different religious types of characters. You could have them at different levels of society, so that you have all of these different adventures interacting. And it all is in a service of exploring and establishing your own version of Glorantha in an interesting way that kind of keeps all of the players interested in different ways. It's really wild and extremely different for the time, and I love it. And it's changed incredibly since then. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of magic in RuneQuest, but it's hard to talk about the specifics of that because what those magics are and how they function have changed from edition to edition. So like the original edition, it's basically kind of like rune magic, battle magic, which is sort of like a practical magic that everyone has access to. Rune magic is more rarefied and tied to religion. And then there's spirit magic, which is sort of like a shamanism. Later on, there's red magic, which is chaos magic, basically. There's always been dragon magic, which is not really accessible by players. And all of these magical systems sort of interact and overlap, and depending on the system are usable by the players, but it's all different. And it's constantly developing, and it makes it very difficult to talk about the system, I think, because when you really have to drill down into a specific system. Okay, we're going to talk about RuneQuest 2 and how it handles magic, which is completely different from RuneQuest 7, which is cool because that means there's a lot of different options for play. But it just makes this topic huge, and I'm serious. We're going to have to talk about like the specifics of Glorantha, and they're cool. It's such a fantastic world. Another episode. We'll do it next.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of layers, I think, to this one, because it is not Dungeons and Dragons. It's a very specific thing, and kudos to them for never trying to be, because they haven't, right? They've never tried to be Dungeons and Dragons. They just kind of always stayed in their lane and just evolved in their own world.
Yeah, and Glorantha and the way it's handled is completely different from anything that you get from a D&D campaign setting. Even Planescape at its weirdest is not quite so weird as Glorantha and the landscape, the mythic landscape that it allows you to access.
Very cool, man.
Yeah.
It's very exciting to me to learn more about it, because it's not something I know I'm going to get to play right away. So the more I hear about it, the more it's enticing to me, the more I'm kind of like, all right, we'll get there eventually. Like, I think this is going to be one of those better around the table games that we'll sit down one day and play.
For sure. And it is a complex system. It feels like even the modern version in 79, like I play with my regular group is relatively new to role-playing games, and we play Call of Cthulhu, which is a system that I think is very simple. It isn't for them. And so like that benchmark, my thing is like Call of Cthulhu is simple, RuneQuest is harder. That means that RuneQuest is probably really hard. Just there's a lot when you're starting to deal with hit locations. Like I feel like that's a pretty good benchmark for complexity. They do a cool thing with the way combat works. It's called strike rank. You're always kind of going at the same time in combat, so like it takes that initiative, that a little bit of that randomness out, but there's still a lot to manage. And especially when you start layering magic odds of stuff, and the battle magic in the early editions is sort of abstract, where it's like, honestly, it reminds me a lot of the original Final Fantasy, how there's like levels of spell. So like you have like thunder, I forget the naming convention in Final Fantasy, but like it's like thun and then thunder and then thundaga is like the big one. It sort of works like that, where like you have these different levels of battle magic which you could apply, and then those modify your rolls and interact in different ways, and like all of that is really kind of cool and makes combat really interesting and crunchy and tactical in a way that's like fine-tuned and not like D&D. But the downside is that it's complex.
Well, very cool, man. I'm excited to get into it eventually when we get back around the tables together. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on RuneQuest?
I do, but it's going to be in the Glorantha episode. It's like a whole other episode of final thoughts.
To be continued. So this is another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG. I actually I did all of the posts for 2022 in 2021, and I didn't do any on RuneQuest, which seems weird because I have a gigantic pile of RuneQuest books. Maybe I'll switch something out.
Well, there you go. I could imagine you sitting here as we're having the conversation, just thumbing through that Instagram. Did we or didn't we?
It's true.
Speaking of Instagram, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and on TikTok at John McGuire RPG. I won't be doing any funny dances, but I am posting more. If you want to pick up my book, Rocket to Russia, 3-2-1 Action presents Rocket to Russia, you can get it over at Exalted Funeral, where you are going to spend your money anyway. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, because your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. And if you really like the show, why not become a patron? Patreon.com/VintageRPG. We got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points. We got a behind-the-scenes look at my RPG 3-2-1 Action. We got early release episodes. We got some other cool stuff coming up. We're getting ready to run some games with our patrons and so much more. If you're on the Discord, join our Discord. We've got a killer community there as well. Patreon.com/VintageRPG. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.